We are doing well on time, and welcome, please. Candace Odgers is a professor at University of California in Irvine. Had a pretty long flight to get here. It's a great pleasure. And she's an expert on adolescence and on technology, social media, smartphones. And they are so present in the lives of the students that all of you meet every day. They play such an important role that I think it's really important to understand the research, the evidence that is there. How do kids use smartphones? What does it do to them? What does it help them? And where might it harm them in their learning, in their behavior? And there's nobody more suitable to tell us that than Candace Odgers. So a warm welcome.
So thank you to the Varkey Foundation and the Jacobs Foundation for having me here to talk to you today. I'm going to talk about an issue that's near and dear to many people's hearts. That's how often their kids are on their smartphones or their students are on their smartphones. Young people today are very rapid and enthusiastic adopters of new technologies, and smartphones have been certainly no exception. Children growing up today are referred to as digital natives, right? So they don't remember a time without the internet, right? Many of us in this room are digital immigrants, so we remember the world before the internet, before our smartphone, before being constantly connected. And today I'm going to take you through some information on how often our kids are on their devices, what they're doing on their devices, and how it might be influencing their health and well-being. So just to start you off with a couple of facts, 70% of kids worldwide are online. There's considerable variability across the world. So the dark purple represents places in the world where up to 94% of kids, adolescents, are online. In still developing and underdeveloped countries, what you have are rates of ownership of devices and being online at about 30%. Right? So considerable variability across time or across the world. If you think about how rapidly this is happening, it's truly amazing. And I'll give you an example from some of the work that we've done where we follow kids in the United States. And here's a graph. On the bottom of it, you have a movement over time. So from 2004 to 2018. And what you've seen is this steep and consistent increase until last year in 2018, 95% of adolescents in the United States owned a smartphone. And it's not only that they're owning a smartphone, they're spending a lot of time on their devices as we think about how kids use their time out of school. Now, one recent survey found that adolescents are spending almost 6.5 hours every day on media-related screen time. So this isn't media screen use related to completing your homework or in school. This is 6.5 hours that is used watching videos, consuming media in front of a screen. So that's a lot of time, right? Now there are some important differences in the amount of time that we find based on where kids live. So kids in low-income households every day spend an average of 3 more hours per day online than their peers who grow up in more higher income families. So that's a tremendous difference in terms of daily time. We heard in terms of sleep deficits of 2 hours, 3 additional hours in the day spent on a screen in these households. So the big question on everyone's mind, every parent, educators, policymakers, as we watch kids today walking around on their phones, spending a considerable amount of time on their devices, is this constant connection harming youth? Right? So what are the effects on mental health, on health and well-being? And I'm going to take you through what we know about that topic today. So what we see in the media is a pretty frightful message. The main message we get is that cell phones are addictive, that your children are constantly on them. And this is a media paper from the UK where they're comparing smartphone use to cocaine, right? So it's an addiction, it's like a drug. There's a claim that smartphones have actually destroyed a generation, right, that have pushed young people to the brink of a mental health crisis that's leading to important problems among kids like depression, like suicidality. There have been a number of investors in Apple who've written an open letter demanding that tech companies start to take this issue seriously based on what they see as evidence that kids are addicted to their phone and it's harming mental health. There was a recent survey here in the United Arab Emirates where the average age at which children got a phone, one of the lowest in the region, was 7 years old, despite the fact that 40% of parents were extremely concerned about the effects of digital devices on mental health. Right? So what's the evidence and what are the fears? Right? So the fears are that smartphone device use is making our kids addicted, depressed, disconnected from the world. So a narrative we often hear is that individuals, kids are glued to their devices, they're disconnected from friends and from family, and that they're losing skills. The skills they're going to need to socially connect, right? And they may be bullied online. But here's the thing that surprised me and might surprise many of you. When you look at the facts, they tell a very different story. So part of the interesting thing for me as a parent, for me as a researcher, has been going through the facts and understanding what they really mean for kids and where they point us in terms of thinking about how to focus on young people today as they engage with digital technology. So I'm going to take you through 3 sets of facts that have been collected from large-scale surveys, so surveys of hundreds of thousands of kids where we find out something about their mental health, something about their digital technology use. I'm going to take you through some daily data. What we do is we actually follow kids on their mobile devices every day. We get reports of what they're doing online, how their mental health is, pings of where they are, their wearable devices. We get information on sleep, for example, to understand what some of the associations between daily digital use and mental health. And then recent reviews that have kind of tried to summarize the research and give us some guidance as parents, as policymakers, as educators, in terms of how we should be reacting to kids' constant connection to devices. So first, the big data, these large-scale studies. This is a study that was released last month. It was a really important study. It brought together 3 large cohorts in the UK and the US and looked at the association among hundreds of thousands of adolescents between how much time they spent online and their mental health. So mental health including feeling of loneliness, feeling of depression. They looked extensively at the data. All of the analyses were posted online in a very open and transparent way. They surveyed over, again, 300,000 adolescents. They conducted over 600 million different analyses to account for the fact that they weren't cherry-picking the results, made everything transparent. And what they found was a very tiny association between the amount of time kids spent online and the reported mental health, right? It actually explained less than 1% of the variation in kids' mental health, which meant in this study that 99.5% of the reasons that kids were different from each other on mental health was due to something other than the reported time online, right? So this was really kind of shocking, this very small association, but there's been all of this concern. The authors did something really interesting next. They compared the size of this association, which they found, really tiny, with a number of other variables that they had in the data set. So characteristics about kids, so whether they rode a bike, whether they ate potatoes, whether they were left-handed versus right-handed. And here's a graph from their work, and what you'll see, and pay attention to this purple bar here, that's the relationship between technology use and well-being, and you'll see that the size of the association between these other factors, so whether you're left-handed, whether you wear glasses, how tall you are, whether you use a bicycle, was actually larger than this correlation, this tiny correlation between how much time you spend online, right, and your mental health. They also looked at the amount of potatoes you ate in the week, and that effect was similar, a little bit larger than the association with technology use. And the headlines then read, screens might be as bad for mental health as potatoes, right? Right. Now the question for me is, does this lead to a campaign against potatoes, right? Eating potato chips, or fear around that? So why, with the same type of association, the same type of relationship, are we so worried about digital technology use? So that's one piece of information. We collect a little bit of a different type of information. We follow kids around on their phones. This is a very interesting activity to do as a researcher. You know, as a parent, you follow your own kids around and pay their bills. So I'll do that for hundreds of kids at a time. Get their streaming data on what they're doing, how much time they're spending online. And this is just a graph of kind of our study design. So 2,000 kids, 400 of whom we go into their homes, and then we follow them intensively from there on their phone, on their devices. And again, when we collect this information in the moment, so what are you doing online, how much time are you spending online, and their mental health, same day within the same kid, so asking within this same kid on days that you use technology less or more, do you have more or less mental health problems? We find virtually no associations, right? The one thing we do find, surprisingly, is the only link we find is that adolescents actually report better well-being and mental health on days when they're more connected, right? When they're more connected online, when they're more active on their social media, or they're more active communicating with peers and friends. So this is counter to what we're hearing, the narrative we're hearing in the media. So the final piece, the summary of this is that Apple investors and the media say that iPhones cause teen depression, but science really doesn't at this point. So people have summarized this information. There are a number of reviews now taking stock of both the observational studies, the experimental data that we have, and other types of information, and they come to the same conclusion, that there's these tiny associations between digital technology use and kids' mental health. They go in kind of opposite directions many times, and they don't match. This is the important point. They don't match the level of concern that we're seeing among parents and the media about the effects of digital technology on kids' mental health. It simply isn't equating. What we do see is that we see a lot of commonalities. So we see many of the same behaviors online where kids go to connect with their friends, right, that we would see in a typical friendship or a typical relationship. So when we analyze data from kids' text messages, when we follow them intensively and try and capture everything they're doing online, it's not that exciting, right? It's kind of the daily life of adolescents connecting about homework, doing things that they would normally do in their friendships. It just looks a little bit different today. So in the words of the adolescents in this focus group, what they say is adolescents just don't get it. They think I'm addicted to technology. I'm not addicted to technology. I'm addicted to my friends, right? This is the source of information of where they get information from their friends and where they connect with them. The other thing that we're seeing in more recent surveys is kids who are struggling with mental health problems are actually reporting that they feel better when they go online. They go online to seek support, right? They go online to maybe distract themselves from things that they're experiencing. So if the solution is for kids with mental health problems to cut off that device usage, that could be exactly the wrong thing to do. So to tie this back to the digital zombie claim, it doesn't appear, based on the evidence we have today, that kids are becoming digital zombies. They look very different. The clear consensus is they're spending their time very differently. They're connected in really intense ways, but it doesn't seem to translate into effects on mental health. It's also the case that, well, we're worried about young people today, and each generation does this. They look back on the generation before and worry about how they're spending their time. We're seeing a lot of progress, right? So across OECD countries, we're seeing higher rates of graduation than we've seen historically. And you see this trend line across each of the countries presented here. We're seeing consistent falling in rates of teen pregnancy and early and unwanted birth outcomes. And in the US, for example, we're seeing declining rates of substance use, of teen pregnancy, and of violence, all costly outcomes that many people have worried about. So the kids today, in these contexts, appear to be doing okay. Now, does this mean that we shouldn't worry about digital devices and smartphones? Absolutely not. But I think that there's a risk in blaming smartphones for young people's problems and for the problems as parents, as educators, that we've been struggling to deal with for a very long time, right? It would be nice to know that we had an identifiable target to reduce kids' burden and mental health problems, but smartphones might not be it. And if we focus on this too much, we run the risk of missing the real causes of issues like depression, like suicide, for example. It distracts us from these really important issues that we see as we look at the landscape of digital technology and the directions it's going. So concerns about children's privacy online, protecting everyone's data, but especially children's data. Age of consent, children are not able to give consent, right? In many cases, we don't think they have the cognitive ability at certain ages or the ability to understand the implications or the long-term ramifications of having information used online, information shared about them online. So what rights do children have in the digital age to access opportunities online, to protect their data and information about them in online spaces? And what responsibilities do we have as educators, as parents, to prepare children for an age that will be digital? There's also the case that there are missed opportunities for intervention and innovation, right? So if much of the time spent is focused on risks to mental health, and something that based on the science so far doesn't seem to be the burning problem for children and devices, we may miss the opportunity to invest our time, invest our resources in many of the great ideas that we just heard at this morning's pitch, for example, of figuring out how to best support children, how to use digital technologies in ways that might provide support, mental health support to kids who otherwise might not get it, to help provide learning opportunities for kids who may not have access, for example. Now, like with everything, there are risks and rewards of growing up in the digital age. And one of the things that has caught our attention is thinking about how opportunities are structured in online spaces, right? So we know offline that children experience very different opportunities, very different levels of investment. And what we find is that happens in online spaces as well. Now, I shared with you the statistic that kids from lower income households spend on average 3 more hours per day on their devices. There's a study of from 25 different nations that's showing what those differences look like in terms of the content of what those kids are viewing and how they're being helped by parents and other adults. And as you'd expect, many children in lower resource settings or in lower resource homes are provided with less support in scaffolding to those digital experiences, in helping to protect their rights online, and ensuring that we don't see the same replication of we see with offline inequalities. And so in recent work that we've done on this, we've documented what we've termed a new digital divide, which isn't about who has access to the devices alone, but it's also about ensuring that when those devices get into the hands of kids, as they are at increasing rates, that we're keeping our eye on how those opportunities can be scaffolded in a positive way for all kids, right? And in this work, we find that, for example, in low-income households, those kids are more at risk, not just for spending their time a little bit differently online, but also having what we call a negative spillover. So having something that happened online affect their offline lives. So as we move forward into the digital age, what we see is that the fear that has taken up so much of the attention around device use and the attention that we've paid to kids interacting with their devices might not be where we need to focus our attention. And what we might need to do is focus more on bridging both the traditional digital divide, which we saw in that very first map, which is a lack of access in some parts of the world to digital technologies, and continue to shrink that gap. But as that gap shrinks, to keep our eye on ensuring that children's, not only their access, but also their experiences and their opportunities and how we support those experiences online are also brought into play. So with that, I will thank the wonderful team that works on these projects, and I will take your questions on digital technologies and teen mental health.
Hi, Hi, thank you for a fascinating talk. As a parent, as a principal, it's equally invaluable. I see your argument about social media sites and social interactions online mirroring those offline. And I see in my own kid, it actually makes them more healthy emotionally when they're interacting online. I get that.
Right.
What about gaming?
Right.
What research is there as to whether excessive, lots of hours on gaming is detrimental or not?
Yeah, so there's the main issue is whether or not the amount of time that kids spend online gaming, so spending video games, might have some negative repercussions. And what you find, and the main concern, this has come up around violence, and what that research consistently shows is there doesn't seem to be an association between time online or playing violent games and engagement in violence yourself. So there's a number of meta-analysis, so large-scale studies that have done that. What we find is that offline risk usually predicts online risk, so kids who tend to be gaming a lot, spending an excessive amount of time online, do have some offline risk factors that might be causing them to use their time a little bit differently or structure their time a little bit differently. So we don't see the kind of impairments in the gaming world, and in fact, for girls, we actually see some benefits in terms of spatial cognitive ability.
I take the liberty, but that's a question
Yes.
from Canada to you.
Hi, Glenn Wagner from Canada. I'm a high school teacher there. Hi. My colleagues and I, we sit around, have lunch, and we, go, oh, those kids and their cell phones, they just can't pay attention anymore. So I'm wondering whether, of course, we know that paying attention is incredibly important in academic success. So is the use of the smartphone somehow affecting kids' ability to attend and concentrate over longer periods of time? Is there any data to suggest that that may or may not be true?
Right. So that is one of the big concerns. So whether or not attention, we're getting the multitasking phenomenon is well documented. So we know in lab-based studies when you're multitasking, your performance goes down. And clearly that's what we do on devices. So there's no question that performance will go down when you're multitasking. So that issue. But your issue is about whether or not we've seen this contribute to things like ADHD maybe, or inattention, ability to attend in general. What we find in our work when we follow kids every day is that the inattention comes first, especially for our high-risk kids. So they start to experience symptoms of inattention and they seek out the phone. So we find that the association goes the other way. The inattention onset and the phone is something that they do to deal with maybe the boredom, something like that. But we haven't, I don't know that there's great data on whether we're going to see this kind of gradual deterioration of attention in general.
Well, thanks. Really great presentation. My name is Samuel. I work with African Institute for Children's Studies, where I'm very keen on this.
Yeah.
We just conducted a study, household-based, in Kenya, looking at both low, middle, and high. I mean, sometimes there's not very much difference, but
Yeah.
We had about 65% of children between 10 and 18 who are accessing smartphone.
Yeah.
And there was not much difference between
Right.
how they use that. But then, I mean, of course, you're really changing the narrative here. But then the question I have is, of course, one, who paid for the study? I hope it's not Google. It sounds like it's very much. But then, could it also be a challenge around we who are migrants into the digital technology? And so we have an understanding of what is normal. And so when you ask a child, is your use of digital media or smartphone really off, then they are thinking, what are you asking? This is what is normal for me. Could that be a problem?
Yeah.
And lastly, globally, is there a known age that we could put a policy and say, perhaps you are safer off mitigating the risks when you begin using smartphone or engaging online, maybe from age 8 or something? I've heard about Sweden, something like that. What would you advise? Thank you.
So first, this gives me opportunity to thank the Jacobs Foundation who paid for that daily research. And so that was the funding, not Google, the Jacobs Foundation. Related to your question about setting a hard age limit, this is getting, lots of people would like an age limit in terms of where we could restrict the use. But if you look into even young children's media, that's being facilitated. So I didn't talk about young children, but young children, most children in the US and OECD countries will have access to an iPad very early, will be spending time on that device. And the age at which children get their first smartphone is declining. And the general argument, I think, is that instead of focusing on so much on whether the kids have the devices, because they're going to, and that we can't seem to kind of stave that, it's investing more time in how those devices are used and how we as adults engage and support kids in those spaces. And the point you made about the research in Kenya, where you don't find the traditional digital divide in access, is a very consistent finding. And in fact, we're finding that in some of our lower income households, that mobile devices are more common, but those differences in scaffolding and supports and kind of opportunities online are persisting. And that's where we think that the effects or the importance of investment might be in reducing that.
Now you need to choose. There are too many things.
Yeah. Good. Oh, sorry, there's...
I'm a journalist from Australia, and we've introduced a ban in smartphones in primary schools. Do you think that's something that is positive, or is it a problem?
Yeah, so the schools are struggling with this in terms of whether to ban smartphones. Interestingly, parents don't like this. So parents don't want their kids on devices, but they don't want to be disconnected from their kids. And so that's a conflict. So when schools ban smartphones, what you get is a lot of parent pushback that I need to be able to contact my kid. You know, schools, the context is going to differ in terms of whether or not that's going to be a positive or negative thing. I think to the extent to which the community and teachers view that as interfering with the learning experience, then that in itself might be a reason to get the device out of the classroom. There's been some really creative integration of devices in the classroom. So for example, in teaching math, doing the surveys, it didn't work this morning, but doing the surveys with the kids, or teaching children how to graph by having the smartphone on and having, as your notifications go off, collecting data on the different notifications kids will get and using it as a tool to explore. Yeah. We're in the back. Yeah.
Hi, Pinky Jane from the United Kingdom. My question is really alluding to the question, the answer you gave earlier about tooling children. I think we all accept that this is the way of the world. Has your research shown up any hints and ideas about the skills that we ought to be considering in terms of living in the digital space, because we can't avoid it? So just a little bit about that would be helpful.
Yeah, so I think we haven't looked specifically at what 21st century skills, would look like on a mobile device, but it's clear that one of the skills is going to be managing the demands of multitasking, right? So figuring out so if we ban devices for kids, but they go out into the work or college environment, they're going to have to deal with that in those settings. So one of the general principles, I think, throughout all of this work is that we might not need, and we likely don't need, to develop all new strategies to support kids in the digital age. Many of the things that work offline are going to work online. So, good communication, good time management, developing those types of skills, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm from India, and I'm teaching 11th and 12th, basically 16 to 18-year-old students. And one problem that consistently comes up with the parents is that my ward stays online and is very poor in offline human interactive skills. So is there any relationship that has come up with this also?
So for specific students being online, so students losing out on the ability to develop offline skills. Yeah. So what we tend to find and what others tend to find is kids who are the most socially skilled offline tend to have the largest social networks online, right? And so there's a lot that's just a reflection of kind of what they're doing. But the online world can help kids who are struggling offline socially to find maybe a group that they're more connected with or that's more like them. There's been some research looking at children who experience anxiety and ways to condition kind of out of that social anxiety, learn ways of interacting online. And so I think it's going to be an interesting process to figure out what works and for whom. But the general idea that kids who are spending more time online become less socially skilled, there's not a lot of evidence that supports kind of that narrative. It's more that kids who might be struggling with social skills have different patterns of online interactions.
Hi there. Thanks so much for your very thought-provoking research. I've been a classroom teacher, secondary classroom teacher for over a decade, and currently managing school support for inpatients in a pediatric hospital. Specifically in the mental health ward, there is an ongoing debate on social media use, ability to use phones. We've let them use them, and then we took them away, and it's just, we're trying to figure out the best balance. But my question is about your research, specifically when you reported that teens are reporting feeling happier. My question is, how did you measure happiness? And especially since just because something makes you happy instantly, that dopamine release, I'm not exactly sure I understand how you measured that and whether or not something that makes you happy in the immediate sense is actually better for your mental health in the long term. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, so there's kind of two pieces to this. The first one is in our research in particular, we're looking at the same kid over time and them reporting how depressed they feel, how lonely they might feel. And so multiple times per day, kids are filling out kind of a brief survey on their phone and reporting on their mood and their emotions in the moment. And what we do is we kind of go across time and we look at variations on that, and you can map that onto how much time they're spending online on a day. And so you're comparing kids to themselves as they go through their life. On days when I spend more time online, what we find is that kids tend to feel more connected, better about themselves, those types of things. So that's how we do it. In the other survey that I mentioned, the second piece, that's kids who are reporting how they feel when they go online, right? And so they have a measure of whether they're more or less depressed in general, where they've experienced those types of difficulties. And kids who tend to experience problems with depression, anxiety, they tend to report, are more likely to report that they feel better about themselves when they go online, that they might use online resources to attract mental health. Now, that's not to say that digital device use is magically curing mental health problems in the same way that we don't have the evidence that it's harming mental health in the same way. But the evidence is mixed, and there's consistent evidence that that there could be some benefits to online connections for mental health. Yeah.
I want to know, did you find it an addiction? I mean, this smartphone is an addiction to the kids? This is one question. And the other question is, did you find any biological effect? You talked about mental illness, but is there any biological effect on the kids, like eyesight or something else?
Right, so there has been this kind of general finding that nearsightedness has increased due to the amount of time on screen. So those are kind of biological big time effects. Your first question is whether we find addiction. Yeah, so I think this has been one of the interesting things in the mobile device world is that everyone reports that they're addicted to their phone. So adults report, parents report it. It's extremely high. This is part of the common conversation about a mobile device is not being able to live without it. But if we think about what addiction is, does it interfere with your daily life, right? Does it cause you to lose out on things that are important to you, like sleep, like eating? If you apply that definition of addiction, we don't see that kind of impairment, right? Now, there's some context, and this has been a big issue in Korea, where they are dealing with a small segment of the population with gaming addiction, for example. But the addiction narrative, the idea of addiction in mobile devices is something that's gotten into the conversation, but it doesn't really fit what the criteria of an addiction would be in terms of impairing kids' lives.
One or two more?
Yeah, sure. Right there.
Hi, my name is Sania, and even though I'm a teacher, I came to this session specifically because I have 2 teen children, and I have been looking at my son's behavior over time. So this is more of a feedback as opposed to a question. And I do realize that he is happier when he has his mobile device. But if I take it away or if he's grounded, then he becomes depressed, he becomes angered. And my concern is he truly addicted to this thing? And while I understand that this is his age, or he's a digital he's a digital being per se, and I'm a digital immigrant. I still do not want my child to miss out on anything that's going on around him, school, studies, but how do I strike the balance?
Right. So this is one of the biggest concerns that parents have, is about time spent online. And one of the things, different way to think about it is think of all the things you want your child to be doing, right? And is their time online interfering with doing those things, either with you or with their family or with their friends? So you can think of it kind of as a menu throughout the day of the different activities and different types of things. And if your child is not struggling in school, if they're spending time with friends, if they're spending time with family, if they're enjoying their life, then we would tend to worry less about the device use for that child, right? But if you find that your child is spending a tremendous amount of time online, that might be a signal that something else is going on, right, in offline spaces too. Final question, yeah.
Who is it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duttenberg-Doyle from Right for Education, and we run the largest social media campaign in Africa. And I just want to make an observation, which is everybody talks about the risk and the problems it creates, and I get daily connected by companies who want to do something which I wouldn't probably call good, and they want to advertise on my site. But how come that never any foundations come to me to share their knowledge, or any research comes to me and says and shares their knowledge? How come that all the companies who say they're for the good of the world and teach something do not use our site, when all the companies who want to sell fast food do find us?
Right. Marketing to children has become a huge industry, right? And this is one of the issues that the main points is that these are the kinds of issues that we should be focusing our attention. So how can we be leveraging the research, what we know about what is good for children, what is good for families in online spaces and digital tools, and work to prevent some of the marketing, some of the pervasion of this into children's lives as children become more connected online. So 30% of internet users in the world are children, right? That is a large share of the marketplace, even though they're not pairs in all kinds of dimension. Those are a lot of eyes on screens. And so they are a very big population and target of advertisers. But it also means that that is where they live, and that is where we as researchers, educators, and people who run foundations can reach them and find them and make investments in them. Yeah.
That's it. It's not surprising they come. It's surprising that the others come.
Right. I agree.
Perfect topic for a lunch conversation, although limit your lunch to 15 minutes, because in 15 minutes, Paige Harden from the University of Texas will tell you whether our genes determine our educational success or not. Who wouldn't be interested in that, right? So please be back and join me in thanking Candace Odgers.